spoke about during you could have one individual is on. Well, I was with the 3rd Marine Division, and this was on Wow. I was with the 3rd Marine Division. And at a recent point where they were coming up, one regiment was coming up a road up peninsula on the edge of the bay there. And our company was sent on a little island called Caithness. And we were just sent there to catch the nips that would be as the regiment was going up. Some of the nips were jumping in the river, and then they would go out of the bay and they'd come across running over us, so we'd be popping them off. So we popped this one off, and we also took a little toilet, right? You know, the toilets, we just took some 2B4s, 4x4s, and just put them right over the rocks. And this nip used to come floating by like this. Right by, well, you know what they did with some of our guys. So this nip would come floating by like this. One of the guys went and put a roll of toilet paper on, and every time he came floating by, you could just imagine what the hell they were. So, but then again, I don't have to tell you what they did to some of our guys. So if you think, you can understand why the hell some of the guys acted the way they did.
Yeah, something came to mind. Talking to some of the kids in the school, they asked us what the other people think of us. Well, I'll give you an example of what happened. We were in the Netherlands for the 50th anniversary. And one of the Irelanders, most of the people in the Netherlands, even the school kids, speak English, except in some poor areas, like on the island where we were and whatnot. And we all finally put a little plaque on the bridge there over the canal. And we're all getting in the bus, and all of a sudden, the canals went for miles. And this canal was from where it goes out of sight on the horizon. Down comes about a 12-foot rowboat with 3 old men in it who couldn't walk. And they had an American flag twice as high as the length of that boat flying on that little rowboat. They couldn't walk, but they got there to see us. They rowed every inch all the way down the canal. Every single man on that bus, tough combat veterans and all had tears in their eyes. So that's just an example of how the people in the Netherlands feel about us.
Okay, thank you. We want to thank our panelists for a great start this morning. Thanks very much, guys. We're going to draw for some door prizes. They're in the back there. The gentleman and the lady back there will show you where they're at. Take your choice. Everybody have half of a gray ticket? Did everybody get one coming in? Okay. Bill, pick one out. Number 31.
I know with you.
41. 24. 8. Number 10. Okay, we're right on schedule. We'll look at the displays, buy some books. Any questions you want to talk to the panelists about? Our next one will start at 10:45. It will be the naval panel. Thank you very much.
Settled. Welcome to our Navy panel this session. Our first speaker will be Mr. John Frank, who served on the USS New Jersey. He was a flight owner of that ship and served on it from 1943
Talking
through
to an
1946.
anti-war guy.
And I'll turn it
Yeah.
over to
Why are we
Mr.
sending
Brown.
Yeah, I
our
was
kids
talking
over
to
to?
him. Yeah, I
I
told
tried
him
to
the same
straighten
story.
them out.
Yeah, I told him the same thing. And he's with a veterans group sometimes.
Good morning.
Yeah.
It's nice to be here with all you people. And
He's entitled to his opinion, but I don't share it.
We're fighting for our very civilization.
We're fighting for his right to continue.
Exactly.
3 years.
Let me grab something.
Good to see you. How's
Enlisted
everything?
in the Navy
Hmm.
in November of 1942, and then I went to Great Lakes Training Camp, and after that I went to the University of Chicago to communication school. And the thing that came out years later I never knew about, when we got there, we used the field house. And what was once the basketball court, they put bunks up there, and that's where we slept, and then we used the facilities that the football players used to use for washing up. But while we were there, they used to send 2 or 3 guys out every night with 45 revolvers, and they used to tour all around the building. And we used to say, well, why? They think the Germans and the Japs are going to come all the way to Chicago? So, but years later I found out they were building the first part of the atomic bomb down there. That's why they built it. They were in the basement underneath where we were. We never knew that, but that was quite a thing to find out later. And after I left Great Lakes, I was shipped to Philadelphia Navy Yard, where I was going to become a crew member of the battleship New Jersey when it was commissioned. So I got there like in January, and we went on board the ship just to learn where everything was, because the ship was mighty big, and you had to find your way around. So we did that for a couple of months, and then the commissioning came, and after the ship was commissioned, in May, in August, we left for a shakedown cruise, and we went up to the North Sea in the cold weather, and tried the guns out in the cold weather. And then after that, we came back to Philly, and they repaired whatever they found wrong. Then we left again, and we went down to the South Caribbean, and they tested the ship out in the hot weather. And they did target practice and things like that. They used to tow things on the back of ships and fire at them. The planes used to tow things and do that stuff. Then we got that finished up. We went back to Norfolk, and we picked up all the ammunition and everything to load the ship up. And at that point, we're up to 57,000 ton after they got all the ammunition and everything on. Then we went through the Panama Canal. It was a very interesting trip. And then from there we went overseas, and we got there in time for the invasion of Marshall Islands and then Inuit, and we supported the troops with the 16-inch guns firing coverage, giving them coverage. And I noticed some fellows here that said they were over there, and they used, that would make some quick.
Want me to hold it up
The holes
for
were
you?
quite big when those shells hit. When we got later on, we were talking to fellows in later wars, and they said that they used to use, when it rained, the holes used to fill up, they used them as swimming pools. That's how big the hole was. And then from the Marshall Islands, we went to Carolinas and New Guinea. And then we went up to Guam and invaded Guam and Tinian. We supported the troops there. Then we went to the Philippines and Lady Gulf, and we supported the troops there. Now, when we got off the Philippines, the Japs were getting a little mad about being backed up to near their own country, so they started using what they call kamikaze planes, where they would come out, instead of just dropping a bomb on you, they'd dive the whole plane, especially after the aircraft carriers. So that was called a battle, the second battle of the Philippine Sea. And then after that, after that was taken care of, we went to Iwo Jima, and we supported the troops in Iwo Jima. And after that, we went to Okinawa, and we supported the troops in Okinawa. And now Okinawa was a little different.
after the troops had landed and it was getting secure, we would get close to the shore then because they were firing back at us. But we noticed that at the end of the cliffs, everybody was jumping off. Women, children, they were jumping off into the ocean. What are they doing that for? But they were told that when the Americans come there, they're going to rape all the girls, kill all the kids, and these people commit suicide. So as we stayed there for days, so all the bodies were just floating by next to the ship, you know. Then, so then after Okinawa, we got closer to Japan then, and they were sort of, felt they were in quite a lot of trouble, and they really got fierce with the kamikaze planes. Now, off Okinawa, we lost 3,000 sailors just off that one island by being killed in aircraft carriers, destroyers that flew up when these planes, hit them. So that was our biggest loss in the naval battle. And so then at the end of the war came. Now we were back for repairs in 1945, and we came back out again, and we just arrived in Guam when they dropped the first atomic bomb. So we had Admiral Spruance on board. It was Admiral Spruance and Halsey. They used to just change commands of the same ships, but they called it the Second Fleet and the Third Fleet. They're all the same ships with the Japs. I guess they didn't know that. I like a lot of ships. So anyway, we did that. Then 60 years. Don't come back to me all the time. So anyway, after the atomic bomb was dropped, we were in Guam, as I said. Then we left Guam and we went to the Philippines, Subic Bay, and we were waiting there with Admiral Spruance, and we were going to go up and have the signing done on our ship in Tokyo Bay. But some congressmen in Washington decide, no, it'd be nicer we do it on the Missouri because President Truman comes from Missouri and it's door to christen the ship. So they switched around and they told us to stay in the Philippines, and all the other ships went up and they had the signing on the Missouri. So then after they left, then we were put up in Tokyo Bay for occupation duties. So we spent about, well, I spent, and I got out, I spent about 2 months occupation duty in Japan. And then I had enough of points, so I left the ship and I went back on transport. And that's how it all went. So see, if anybody has any questions about the New Jersey, I'll try to answer it for you.
I will pretty much answer your questions and to tell you that the 3rd Division felt like New Jersey was our brother, and our brothers there because you guys were with us in Guam. And in fact, we were up on the first ridge line, and one of your shells came on our ridge, and it made a slit trench for about 300 yards, about 3 foot deep. And we just stood there and looked out to your battleship and said, my God, we can travel all that distance. And as far as the shells, yeah, we bathed in your shell holes. With the water that would be in it, we kicked the frogs out first, the muddy water, and so the Jersey was there with the camouflage, and I said it was like a camaraderie because you guys, when they broke through, when the Nips broke through on that ridge line at one time, your shells, I could see your shells laying right on the ridge line coming down as the troops, as the Nips were breaking through. So Jersey was there. God bless you guys.
Thank you. Yeah, the Marines in Vietnam said the same thing. And they used to call in fire, the Jersey was the only battleship there, and it was just patrolling. So they would call in when they were, bogged down or something and fired. And they said, gee, that's great. The next day when it rained, we all had swimming pools to go into. Yeah, they were very thankful for what New Jersey did for them too.
We'll have more time for questions after each of the panel speakers has spoken, and then we'll do the same as last time. We'll finish off the hour and a half with questions and answers. Mr. Ray Laura had a little varied service. He started out on the Liberty ship and ended up in LSTs, and he's going to tell you about it.
I want to thank you, everybody, that came this morning. I enlisted in the Navy in 1942, and I took my basics at Bainbridge, Maryland. And another thing too, I don't know if anybody knows where Blandon, Pennsylvania was. It's a small town of 500 population. That's where I was born, outside of Reading. After serving, after being at Bainbridge and taking my basic training, I was transferred to gunnery school in Norfolk, Virginia. And from there, after 6 weeks of gunnery school, I was sent to Fort Maine to pick up a brand new Liberty ship. And by the way, there's only 2 Liberty ships left out of thousands. The one is the John Brown down in Baltimore, and also the Thomas O'Brien, which is out in San Francisco. Now, I don't know if any of them are going over for the 60th anniversary of Normandy or not. But after I picked up the John Sullivan, brand new, in Fort Maine, I went to Boston, and we loaded up our cargo, high-octane gasoline, and all the other war supplies, and then on to New York to pick up a convoy. I didn't know it at the time, but I was headed for North Africa. After approximately 2 weeks, we were in Oran, North Africa. And there, we unloaded all our supplies and then picked up iron ore to take back home. I come back to Philadelphia. I was in here for about a week and a half, and then we went to Baltimore and picked up more supplies and headed back to North Africa. At that time, we went to, our first port was Algiers, and then on to Bizerte, North Africa, where we had in the Bizerte and Algiers, we had several air raids with no casualties. After Algiers and back to Bizerte, we hit some, after we unloaded in Algiers and we left Bizerte, we went to, it took us over 30 days to get back to New York because we hit a bad storm. And by the way, there was 147,000 men and officers that served on Liberty ships, and we were called the Naval Armed Guard. After I come back in December of '43, I was transferred to the LSTs. I was transferred to the LST 283. LST stands for Landing Ship Tanks. Other names, large slow targets, and large snapping turbines. They were approximately 328 feet long, 50 foot wide. We had one 40 millimeter gun, and we had one 3-inch 50 and 10 20 millimeter. There was over 1,000 LST built. The British used the similar type LST in the evacuation of Dunkirk to meet the conflicting requirements of deep draft for ocean travel and slow draft for beaching operation. The ship LST was designed with a large ballast system that could be built for ocean passage and pumped out for beach operation. It took months to build the LST. By the end of the war, it was down to 2 months. LSTs took part in the invasion of Solomon Islands, other islands in the Pacific, campaigns also Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and southern France. LST-43 was built in Philadelphia. LST-282 and the 283 were built in Pittsburgh in October of 43. After 283 was launched in Pittsburgh, it went down the Ohio Mississippi River to New Orleans. This was where they put a small boat called LCT on the main deck and headed for Boston. There we picked up 35 Navy medics and 4 doctors. Also pontoons, various sizes of canned foods and vegetables, and on to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where we got the convoy for England. It took about 17 days. Some of the men did get seasick, but there was one poor sailor named Cregan. He was 17 days in the bunk with a bucket. God bless him. He made about 225. When he got to England, he was down to 160. We landed in Plymouth, England, where we unloaded our cargo and then began training with divisions of LSTs off the coast of England. After several training and maneuvers exercises, the day before the big one came on July the 5th. Between 5 and 6 Army officers and men, and put American flags. They put American flags on all the vehicles that we had on our LST. And they also put a Marine Guard at the captain's quarter. Around 11 at night on June the 5th, we sailed from Dartmouth Harbor and headed for the beach, one side at daybreak. Wherever you looked, there was some kind of ship and planes filled the sky. We sailed between the USS Texas and shore, and we could see and hear the shells loaded on the beachhead. 283 was very lucky. We were headed for Utah Beach rather than Omaha. Omaha didn't almost make it. There was hell. We landed at Utah around noontime. It was then secure. As the Army and the equipment got off the ship, we then became a small hospital ship, casualties, cable board. When we were full, we headed for England and more supplies. This went on for many weeks. And by the way, I don't know if everybody had any fish and chips in England. They're best when they're in the newspaper, believe me. Fantastic. After we left England, after approximately, I think it was 8 weeks, we headed for Bizerti, Tunis, and then on to Naples, Italy for regrouping, While in Naples, we did get fresh vegetables. Again, LST was lucky. The invasion of southern France, where we landed, was secure with hardly any casualties. LST-50 and my ship 283 hit the beach with 282 standing off, waiting to come in. A German bomber with a radio patrol bomb guided the bomb onto the 282. It was preparing to beach, and their hatches were open, and the troops in their tanks and trucks. The tank deck and main topside was held. On Earth, when the bomb hit, it caught fire, men jumped overboard, some in flames, some with broken arm and leg. Captain Perry ordered the small boats to head for the 282 to save those that could be saved. The doctors and medical staff from LST-283 again did a heck of a job with the casualties from the 282. Upon leaving the beach, we sailed for Corsica with lots of trips from Corsica to the French 50-foot record. 10,000 troops has been carried, 2,000 vehicles carried, 6,600 casualties carried and cared for, and 2,000 prisoners of war delivered. In November, we left Oran for the convoy to Norfolk, Virginia. After unloading Norfolk, we sailed to Brooklyn Navy Yard for overhaul of the ship to be ready for the trip to Pacific. After my 30 days leave, I was assigned to a ship in Norfolk, Virginia, which was an LCI converted gunboat. After serving a short time, the LST, again, after serving a short time, it went to the Japanese waters, was returned to Pearl Harbor, and was decommissioned in 1946. Struck from the Navy in January of 1947. She was sold in Hawaii for conversion to merchant service. Again, she was purchased by the Purdue Navy and December 51 for service in Purdue Navy as LST-34. At the present, the United States LST Association is in Greece hoping to bring back the 325, which is back in Mobile, Alabama now. And it's a memorial ship. And hoping for July 2000 and to have our national convention side, and it'll be in the Adams Park Hotel on City Line Avenue. It'll be in July. I don't have the date right. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Joseph Nemeth.
I served in the Navy on the board the DE 342, the Richard W. Seasons, mainly as
He was
communications
our first
officer.
first and second speaker.
The destroyer escorts were produced because of the urgent need for protection of convoys against submarines, but later on the Ds got assorted duty. The ships were smaller and less armed than the destroyers and were quickly produced. About 260 were commissioned by the end of 1943. A good-looking young lady in the blue.
I don't know if I've shown you this or
I
not.
have a couple of pictures.
99.
These, and
She,
you can pass them
let's see.
around. She doesn't recognize that she's a good-looking young lady. Anyhow, you can see that because of the hot and humid conditions, many of the men would bring their
During
bedding.
World War II and 3 years of Russian occupation.
My talk will be
I'll give a copy to
primarily
you sometime.
restricted to the Battle of Lady Gulf, which was the largest, the historians tell us anyhow, is the largest naval battle in history, and it was actually the latest battle where battleships would be fighting against battleships. About the middle of, I was told that the talk was 1944, so that at the middle of 1944, the war in the Pacific was starting to
He's
look
petitioned his school
improve the situation for the United States.
and gotten their approval.
Of course,
I told him I
armed
wanted to
forces were
introduce
doing
him to
their
you.
job, but I want to say that
First,
the success, a big factor in the success was
Okay.
the work being done in the States.
I could point him out to
Production
you.
of all the materials, we can
He's,
see battle on two fronts.
He's right next to the guy with the Philadelphia.
All the training of people, particularly
DAV.
pilots, the production
Yeah.
of ships.
And the guy next to him is
Just heard
a
about-
buddy of his.
So the
So,
production effort at
Try to talk
home
to him.
was a real major part of the role and the success that we were having. In the summer, late summer of 1944, President Roosevelt and his key military people made a surprise visit to Pearl Harbor. There he met with MacArthur, Nimitz, and others to determine the next major invasion site.
I showed him some of this stuff that you had copied off for me,
Which is now Taiwan,
and
or the
told him what you were
Philippines.
doing.
On the side, it might have been a completely different historic picture if we had gone to Formosa and then into China. But anyhow, the Philippines were selected as the invasion site, and the landings were to be started on October the 20th. There was a whole lot of action needed to put these plans together to meet this October 20th target. Most of these ships were assembled at a place called Manus in the Admiralty Islands, which was below the equator. I know you won't be able to see all this from this map, but we have just to get a picture of it. This is less than half of the size of the Pacific, so you know that the United States is pretty far over here. And we're talking about Manus, and then up here in the Philippines, of course, Japan up here. So that this was the site that we were going to get. Now, Admiral Kincaid, the Admiral of the 7th Fleet, was in charge of the invasion force and was made up of 3 major groups. One was the fire support group. When we say the fire support group, this is the group that comes in and shells the beaches to make the beaches clean and clear for the troops to land. The fire support group was a unique group of 6 old battleships, mainly 6 old battleships that had been damaged in Pearl Harbor. Most of these ships had been brought back to service, and here they were to serve an important role in this battle of the Philippines. Next were 3 unique groups of 6 baby carriers, these small aircraft carriers, CVEs, and with them were 6 escorts. And the code name for these little groups to provide air protection for the invasion force were Taffy groups. So the first group was 6 baby carriers, 6 escorts. Next group, 6 carriers and 6 escorts. And the third group, 6 carriers. So there were 18 of these small carriers, each of them holding about 30 planes. Following this was the landing craft, supply ships, and vast number of LSTs and whatever was necessary to make the landing. We were part of the 2nd RPE, was part of the 2nd group in the Taffy group. Now, operating separately from Kincaid's invasion force was Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet. This was the great 3rd Fleet of 14 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 20 cruisers, and many destroyers. Halsey's objective with his 3rd Fleet was to eliminate land-based planes in the Philippines and the other areas, seek out Jap ships. When I use the term Jap ships, I'm not trying to be derogatory, but just to say this is the term that we use, and to protect the invasion forces. Now, the invasion at Leyte in the Philippines started with the massive shelling on the beaches for several days before the actual invasion by these old battleships. And the landing started as scheduled on October the 20th. Now, we're going to talk about the battle, but I'll just interject here that the actual invasion was successful, and we did take control of Leyte Island, and the Jap Army death toll was about 80,000 men, and we lost about 3,000 men as we plan to try to destroy and actually eliminate the invasion forces at Leyte. To them, it was very important that they be victorious in destroying this invasion force, because it would appear as if they were right at the brink of being part of the war. So what we have, and you won't be able to see this either, but later on if you're interested, here we have the Philippines, and this is Lady Gall. And so we had two Jap fleets meeting at the Mindanao and the sea to go up to Surigaya Strait. And this combined fleet was 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. And then we had Admiral Corita. He was going through San Bernardino Strait, and he had 5 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. Now, his battleships, he had 2 of these super battleships. When we say super battleships, they were much larger than ours, and they had 18-inch guns. Coming down from Japan was an Admiral Ozawa. He had 4 aircraft carriers. They were the only 4 remaining aircraft carriers. The rest had been destroyed in earlier battles. 3 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 13 destroyers. So their objective was to come down and destroy all the ships in Lady Gall. And Ozawa, his job was to lure Halsey. Remember we talked about Halsey having the great Third Fleet? His job was to come down and have his planes contact Halsey, and then he would head back toward Japan and hopefully have Halsey follow him and get him away from the invasion forces of Lady Gall. Now, the start of the battle took place on October the 23rd, just 3 days after the initial landing. 2 of our submarines were in the sea as the Jap ships were approaching, and they sank one of the cruisers, and one of our submarines was lost in the engagement. But the main thing they did, they alerted Kincaid and his forces in Lady Gall of the approaching Japanese fleets. Now, Ozawa's fleet came down from Japan, as we said, and drew Halsey away from the Philippine area. And Halsey contacted the Japanese ships, and he went north, and as they were going north, land-based planes from North Philippines sank the aircraft carrier Princeton and badly damaged the cruiser Birmingham. Now, on the night of October the 24th, Kincaid believed Halsey was still in the area to protect the ships and wasn't really concerned, but when he became aware of the approaching Jap ships up in Surigaya Strait, he sent the old battleships lined them up, and as the Jap battleships came up through Surigaya Strait, actually the admiral in charge was Admiral Ohlendorf. These old battleships, the Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Maryland, West Virginia, and California, as we said, they had been badly damaged in Pearl Harbor. They formed what was called the Cross the T formation. So they had all their guns directed to the Japanese battleships as they were coming up, and they were able to sink and destroy most of the Jap battleships. In this battle, The Japs lost four battleships, 5 cruisers, and 5 destroyers, and only one of the ships from this group returned to Borneo. Now we return to Corita, who was going through St. Barnabino Strait. And as I said, we have these 3 taffy groups. We work with taffy too. Each taffy group had 6 small aircraft carriers and 6 destroyers or destroyer escorts. Now, he passed through the strait, and as he was coming down, and of course his job, original plan was to go into Lady Gulf and wipe out all the invasion forces. But as he came down, he saw the aircraft, we were able to observe the aircraft carriers in Taffy 3 and started heading for these 3 Taffy groups. And the 3 Taffy groups went east as fast as we could, but certainly not fast enough to get away from Corita's group. All the ships in the Taffy groups were general quarters, and we're retreating as fast as we could, and the carriers all sent their planes against Corita's groups. The Japanese started shelling. The Japanese used colored shells to indicate to them for their fire control how close they were coming to the ships. The Taffy 3 group, destroyers and destroyer escorts, made smoke to protect the carriers as best they could, and then they received orders to make torpedo attacks against the coming battleships from Corita's group. This was a delaying action. Everything was being done to protect the carriers. Our ship, along with the others, was also making smoke, and we were prepared to turn around and make a suicide, I would say, torpedo attack. And we were happy about this, but it was not really understandable why, after Corita was very close to destroying all 3 of these, he turned around and returned back through St. Barnabino Strait. The thought was that perhaps there was a lot of air traffic going around. Where the hell's Halsey, and why aren't we getting more protection? And I guess he had also heard about the battle that happened with the other 2 Japanese fleets. But for some reason, Corita turned around. Now, meanwhile, up north, we have Halsey chasing Ozawa's fleet with the 4 remaining aircraft carriers. Halsey made contact, his planes made contact with his fleet, and as we said, he had 14 carriers, so we had lots of airplanes, and they just made massive attacks, one after another, and they wiped out the 4 remaining Japanese aircraft carriers and destroyed and caused very large damage against the Japanese ships. So a summary of the Battle of Leyte: the Japs lost 4 aircraft carriers, none were left, 6 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 12 destroyers. Now, the United States only lost, and I say only, but any loss is bad. We lost 1 large carrier and 2 small carriers. Corita's ships were able to bombard 2 of our small carriers. We lost 1 cruiser, 3 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. So it was a significant naval victory, and I think a big turning point in the war. I have some notes from our sister ship, the only DE that was lost in this battle, the Samuel B. Roberts, in this battle at 0650, the ship went to general quarters because the enemy fleet was contacted. At 0658, they were getting large caliber shells coming very close to their ship. 0700, they received orders to make a smoke screen, and about 15 minutes later to make a torpedo attack and start firing their 5-inch guns against battleships. They fired 608 5-inch guns against the battleships. About 0900, they took about 20 hits from 14-inch shells and had to abandon ship. If I could find it, some remarks from the captain of that ship that I think is very appropriate at this time. This was Lieutenant Commander Copeland. To witness the conduct of the average enlisted man on board this vessel with only an average of less than 1 year's service would make any man proud to be an American. The crew was informed at the beginning of the action of the commanding officer's estimate of the situation. Fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected, during which time we would do what damage we could. In the face of this knowledge, the men zealously manned their stations, fought, and worked with such calmness, courage, and efficiency that no higher honor could be conceived than to command such a group. As I said, I limit my talk to the Battle of Leyte, but we were involved later with the invasions of Manila Bay and Guyangop, and of course we spent most of our time up at Okinawa. Finally, I was surprised to get a letter November the 2nd, 1951. This is well after back to civilian life, from the Chief of Naval Personnel, which stated that the Navy Unit Commendation Award was given by the Secretary of the Navy to the USS Richard W. Seasons DE-342 for outstanding heroism in action against enemy Japanese aircraft, shore batteries, and submarines during the following operations: Leyte Operation, the Guyan Gulf Landing, Manila Bay Operation, and Okinawa Operations. Thank you.
We have time for some questions, so if anyone has some questions, yes, sir.
Ray, I understand that ship they brought back, that the men went over, had to rebuild the engines and everything.
One of the jobs they did 2 years ago, I went down to Mobile, Alabama, and I went aboard it, and they're doing a fantastic job. And it's just, they got it from Greece, and I think the youngest guy was 73 years old when they brought it back. They've done a fantastic, and right now I think it's up and down the Mississippi going to different ports. But they brought it back, and it's the only one that I know of afloat, and it's a memorial ship. And anybody wants to make a donation, please do, because it costs a lot to operate.
Mr. Laura, while you have the microphone, could you tell us a little bit more about what your personal duties were when you were on the LST?
When I was on the LST, I was in charge of the 40 millimeter and the 20 millimeter gun on our ship. Also, in time of need, I also served on the small boats too.
Any other questions? In the back there, yes.
For the fellow on the seas, the DEC mentioned the suicidal potential impact of the torpedoes. A little bit I read about the American torpedoes, that there would have been suicide, that the quality of the torpedoes improved, if you know anything about that, because in the beginning of the war, our torpedoes were terrible.
Yeah, and I think particularly, I think they improved dramatically near the end. I think our submarines actually did a very good job in sinking the Japanese ships. I think we had very little experience with using our torpedoes. We had them, and I think indeed you're right that it would have been a suicide attempt. But what we were attempting to do was to protect the carriers, to do whatever we could, and just making a torpedo attack, successful or not successful, it would cause the Japanese ships to, cause them to maneuver out of the way, perhaps not get as close to the carriers as they would have without making smoke, shooting, and particularly the Roberts, it spent like an hour firing their 5-inch guns at these ships, and somebody remarked it was because they were not heavily armed, that the DEs didn't have all this armor, that the Jap shells went right through them, and that's why they were able to stand afloat that long. But the sad thing is that I don't know why the Navy did not do a better job of rescue. We during that battle, the Ds and destroyers were picking up a lot of the pilots who were attacking the Jap fleet, and then afterwards they would make dry runs. They no longer had bombs or ammunition, but they would make dry runs to try to divert the Japanese ships. And a number of these were not able to return to their carriers. They would run out of fuel, so our ship picked up pilots from 3 planes, and I know that many others were picked up similarly. I don't know whether I think, did I answer your question? Sometimes my wife accuses me of making political speeches.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Dr. Terry, in relationship to Lady, where was the Battle of Midway?
Midway was much earlier, and we can look at the map later, but it too was a very important battle, but this was the last and the largest one.
I'd like to ask Mr. Haran a question. When you were on the New Jersey as a signalman, can you give us a little bit more exactly what your duties were? Was it the same? Did you work with flags or lights or a combination?
Yes, we had signal lights that we send Morse code with a blinking light. We use semaphore flags, and then we use flags that we run up to change courses. Like when Admiral Halsey was on, he would control where the ships were going. So he would come out, not him, but his officers would come out, and they'd tell us we're going to change up, from say 175 degrees to 250 degrees. So we'd run up 250 on average, and then we'd look around, and when all the ships, they would put up the same thing, that they all received it. The only thing, once in a while, the DEs were way away. Couldn't see that far. So anyway, then when we released the flight to come down, then all the ships turned to what position we had up there.
And how many men were part of a signal crew? How many people?
55. That's what we covered, watches all night long, 24 hours a day. And we were right on these signal bridges right behind the Admiral's Bridge. And so he was always sitting right up front of this nice chair.
So you knew all the scuttlebutt?
We used to have coffee every morning together, Admiral Halsey and us. When he was in there drinking out of China, we were
throwing mugs and bricks. You had mentioned kamikazes. And I wanted to, you did note how serious it was to the United States Navy, how many men and ships were really injured and killed during those activities. And it started right after the Battle of Leyden. And what had happened, it became such a serious event that MacArthur and Nimitz decided that they would not publicize this because they didn't want to allow the Japs to know how important it was, and also that we didn't want to panic the people back home with what was happening. Our experience was at Okinawa. We were up there for about 3 months in between Okinawa and Japan, and we got very good air protection during the day, but our planes seemed to go to sleep at night, except for a few Marine planes that would be night fighters. But the Japs would come early in the morning and late at night, and you know, they only had enough fuel to get to the area and their job. You know, we talk about suicide missions nowadays, and I couldn't understand in those days where the individual bright enough to learn how to fly a plane would fly 500 miles or so and be willing to kill himself. But, you know, this dedication or reverence for the emperor was such a driving force that these people were willing to do this. And I can't remember the number, but some 500 of these fellas, you know, these were great people to be able to fly airplanes and, you know, fly down here, but they were willing to do this. And it did cause a lot of damage and killed a lot of our people, and but in the long run, we won the war.
It's like today, you know, he was like you know, a religious leader to them. If you died in a kamikaze plane, you automatically went to heaven, just like the fellows over there. They believe that.
I don't know why the virgins were.
Yeah, they didn't say anything about virgins. They got a better deal going now than they did. But it was in their religion, and these young fellows would line up and have a glass of sake before they left, and they're all young kids, and never came back.
Do you volunteer on the New Jersey now? Do you do any work with the...
I worked on it for 2.5 years when we refurbished it. But I gave up being an escort. Climbing those ladders all day long. It's too much.
I have one more thought. I keep thinking of things. After the war was over, we spent several months at a place called Wakayama. It's after the war. And then after the war, I made maybe 12 or 15 business trips to Japan. And early on, I didn't talk too much about the war or anything like this, but became very friendly with Japanese people. These were business trips. And on one occasion, we got close to Wakayama, and I started talking about it, and he said, one of the men said, let's spend the night in Wakayama then, and maybe you can recall the beach area there. So we went to this hotel. Somehow he was able to arrange for a woman who had been there as a young girl at the time. And he asked her, what was it like when the Americans came? He said, we were told that the Americans were going to come and kill the men and rape the women and all this. So we all ran to the hills, and then we came back and started working. They didn't allow us to be cooks, but they allowed us to clean up, and we got all this. They had so much food, and they were willing to buy souvenirs from us for candy, cigarettes, and soap, and whatever, but that's the end of the war.
I just want to point out that a lot of the men that served on the merchant ship, they went to Russia, and sometimes they went there with 25 ships and only come into Merman. And also, I served with a fellow sailor, and he was sunk at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. But I have high honor for the guys that served on the Merchant Marines, and also the Navy gunners that took care of all the guns and so forth. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, sir, come front.
I might mention that the next speaker for the World War II lecture is a merchant mariner, and he was on the Merman's run, and he put in 100,000 miles.
And what's the date for that in Abington?
Next Tuesday in Abington, at 3 p.m.
It's the Abington Public Library on Route 611, Jerk Road. And I saw someone else's hand. Yes, sir.
Mr. Grant on New Jersey. I was a Marine in Vietnam, 1st Marine Division. One night we were close to the coast laying out ambushes in the middle of the night. And this thing was flying over our heads. I've never seen or heard anything like that. Everybody had to call back and get new pants the next day. I never saw a Marine after for about 3 hours after they were all burrowed into the ground. It was
That's what I was talking
an
about.
awesome thing for that to go over your head.
That's what I was talking about before we talked to the Marines from Vietnam. They were saying when those shells came over and they hit the ground and made a big enough hole we could have a swimming pool the next day with a range. Yeah, I've met a lot of Marines that come visit the ship and that were over there. And they have a lot of respect for the New Jersey for, I said, boy, when they fire the gun, they hit right on target, you know.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Still have a few minutes, I think. Okay, hold on one second.
I want to explain about our book sales here. We contacted Borders Books in Langhorne about 3 months ago, and they kept passing me off from one manager to the other. And finally, they told me that they couldn't set up a table here today because they had some other event going on. So it was a last-minute decision to get the books that we did. We had to open up accounts so we could get the discount and the tax-free thing. So we're not neglecting the Navy by not having any Navy books here. There's a new book out on the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And the last conference we had, I think it was 1999, we had Thomas Cutler, who was a professor of history at Annapolis, and he wrote a great book, The Battle of Leyte Gulf. So you can find both of them today if you go on the internet or Borders or Barnes & Noble. And also you have the classic 16 volumes of Samuel Eliot Morrison's The United States Navy in World War II. You can look them probably up in your library. Thank you.
Mike, I guess the most recent book is the Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. Is that the one that is just a more recent book on the destroyers and destroyer escorts at Leyte Gulf? Any other last questions? Yes, sir.
Well, about 30, 40 years ago, I remember, speaking of Liberty ships, there was hundreds of them tied up the middle of Hudson River towards West Point. They all scrapped.
Yeah, there's only 2 left. The John Brown and the Thomas O'Brien. Only 2 Liberty ships left.
Take a ride on the Brown if you go down to
You go down to Baltimore, you can take a trip on.
Take me out to the 6, take me 4 hours.
Yes, ma'am.
Are they going to be in Normandy or UK?
The Liberty ship, that I don't know. I know one time the John Brown wanted to go, but when they got to New York and the Coast Guard looked at it, they said, no way, you need a lot of rivets. So they've had the rivets since then, but I don't know if they're going over.
They say there's supposed to be a mob.
I know the O'Brien went for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, because my wife and I were out in San Francisco last summer, and we were talking to some of the volunteers, and they were at I don't know if this is a apocryphal story or not, but they told us they were out in the bay on a shakedown cruise, and there were some Coast Guard officers there making inspections, and the captain, who apparently was a crusty veteran, was ready to go to Normandy, and the inspectors were still looking around, and finally the captain supposedly told the Coast Guard officer, "If you want to go to Normandy, welcome along. If not, you better get off. I'm leaving." So it sounds like it could be a real story, but I'm not sure. Yes, sir.
Again, I'd like to go back to the Jersey, New Jersey. There was nothing more comforting than to be working up the ridge line and you could just look back, and there was the Jersey right offshore, just every one of our guns just facing. And at night, same thing, just laying on foxholes and see those red, right through red flames going over. So the Jersey was in, it was good feeling, and God bless you guys.
Then you mentioned that, you know that they took the Jersey out of there after a while because the Vietnamese, North Vietnam, they were complaining they won't sign a treaty unless you get that ship out of there. They went over in France, they brought that up. They said, we're not going to talk peace with you until you get that ship out.
Okay, Mike, I guess we have one more question. I guess we have some time for some more book raffle.
We were in Normandy in the foxhole, and they were on the fire in Carrington. It was a wreck hit right on the Carrington Railroad. You see the pictures when we got there, those railroad lines just put up the wreck. Those skeleton over our heads sound like a freight car. Some trees, you see the trees kind of like this, but it was stacked back, there was no leaves left. You actually feel the foxhole in your hand vibrate. That's like something over our heads.
Mike, a little time for some more door prizes?
5 more raffles we can browse around. Lunch is right next door to Sycamore Road, and that starts at 1:00.
Okay, we'll just do a few more door prizes, then 5 more. Would you like to pull a number? Here again, as your number's called, just go back and pick any of the books. Number 29. 29. Congratulations. Number 26. You don't count. Put it back. No. Okay. Number 6. Back over here again. Number 44. And the last one before lunch. Don't fight back there over the books.
I know.
Last one before lunch, number 43. There you go. Okay, we'll break for lunch, and like Mike said, look around at the display.
You can't use that one back there, can you?
We'll be starting in a few minutes. We're going to raffle off 5 more door prizes.
Like bid on the 3rd Bike Series.
For the door prize, number 16. 16, anybody got that?
I got it.
We ought to have a good choice.
It's like
Number 22. 2, somebody have that? Okay. Number 11.
What do we need, 37 or 38?
Yes.
Three.
Number 18.
The lady out front made a great. Very nice.
Number 19. Okay, I'd like to introduce now our keynote speaker, Dr. Thomas Childers. He's a Sheldon and Lucy Hackney Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of 4 books on World War II, including Wings of Morning, the story of the last American bomber shot down over Germany in World War II. His latest book, In the Shadows of War, An American Pilot's Odyssey Through Occupied France and the Camps of Nazi Germany, was a selection of the Book of the Month Club, the History Book Club, and the Military Book Club. Dr. Childers will talk today on his book, The Shadows of War, 3 Lives United by the French Resistance. And some of you may remember a few years back, I asked Dr. Childers to mention this, but his book, Wings of Morning, Stephen Ambrose was accused of plagiarizing the book. Maybe he'll tell us a little about that adventure. But we're delighted to have him here today. He's a new father. His wife had a baby yesterday. So we're happy he's here. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Thomas Childers.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon. Honored certainly to be on a program with these distinguished veterans. I am a little shell-shocked today, I have to say. The baby is 48 hours old. I'm 57 years old. This was so with a lapse of 16 years between this one and the last one, I have a certain shell-shock quality about me today. So if I mutter incoherently, you'll understand. I was thinking as I was coming up here that 16 years ago, when my other child was born, I rushed out of the room, also from the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, over to a lecture hall. I was standing up lecturing to a large group, and I kept smelling something. Something doesn't seem quite right here. Looked down on my lapel, and I'd been burping the baby. And, I guarantee I'm all right. You can come close to me this afternoon. This afternoon, I want to tell you a story. It's a story about war, about the Second World War. It's not about strategy. It's not a story about policy or decision-making or decision-makers. It's not about the diplomacy or the sociology of war. It's cultural or economic implications. The story forms the core of a book I've written, the second in a trilogy about the Second World War. The first, as I mentioned, was Wings of Morning. The second, In the Shadows of War. The third is a book that I hope will be out next year called The Best Years of Their Lives, about the transition made by this generation of men as they came home from the Second World War, something about which there is virtually nothing written. But today it seemed, particularly since you were focusing on the year 1944, this story from In the Shadows of War seemed to be a particularly appropriate topic. In the summer of 1944, climactic year of the Second World War, 3 young people, unknown to each other and separated by background and nationality, were hurled together by fate. Like millions of their generation who did not make policy or formulate strategy, they found themselves caught in a world convulsed by war. Colette Florin was a school teacher in a small village just east of Paris. In the fall of 1942, she had stumbled into a secret life of resistance and danger. She had stepped out of the crowd during an afternoon when planes were falling out of the sky right and left, watched the parachute blossom above her, And as other people from this small village stood and looked, an American pilot had landed in a field. And for reasons that she said years later she could never really quite understand, because all of them stood around, nobody doing anything, she had stepped out of the crowd and motioned for the American to come with her and had hidden him. And this would be the first step into a life of resistance in the underground. The second person is Pierre Mousson. He was the son of a wealthy family from the south of France, a university graduate, a veteran of the French army from the debacle of 1940. Since 1943, he had also been an undercover agent of the British Secret Service, SOE it was called, Special Operations Executive, operating a resistance organization in occupied France. The third person is a man named Roy Allen, who was a star athlete from the Albany section of Philadelphia, not so very far from here. He was recently married, a baby on the way. Before the war, he'd never ventured very far from home. By the spring of 1944, he was a bomber pilot in the American 8th Air Force, flying missions against targets in Nazi-occupied Europe. Their paths were about to converge in a small village in France, and for them, and for countless others like them, their lives would be forever changed. In the Shadows of War tells their story. John Hersey, the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist and journalist, once observed that the task of the historical novel is, quote, not to illuminate events, it's to illuminate the human being caught up in the events. It's possible in fiction to make a reader identify with the human beings in the story, to make the reader feel that he himself took part in the great and despicable events of the story. History allows its readers to witness the past. Fiction, he wrote, gives its readers an opportunity to live it. What I've tried to do with the books that I've done in this trilogy on the Second World War is actually to turn John Hersey's statement on its head. That is, the story of Roy, Colette, and Pierre offers, it seems to me, a vehicle for just such a project to illuminate the events of the Second World War through personal stories, to illuminate the events of the war through the human beings caught up in them, and to allow readers not only to observe and analyze that terrible conflict, but to put readers into the action, to allow them to see it, to smell it, to feel it, while at the same time maintaining historical accuracy. So the book it's a true story. It's based on extensive interviews, diaries, letters, debriefing reports, courtroom testimony, military records, government documents in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States. And it draws on numerous memoirs and first-hand accounts of events. So what is the story? On June 14, 1944, Roy Allen, a pilot in the 457th Bomb Group, 3rd Air Division, 8th Air Force, was on a mission to bomb a German aerodrome outside Paris. It was the crew's 12th mission in that most dangerous of theater of operations. I think I probably don't need to say very much about this to this particular audience, and to some in particular I certainly don't. But for the 8th Air Force, flying in Europe, the 8th and later the 15th Air Force as well, that would prove to be the most dangerous of all theaters of operations for flying. During the first year of operations for the 8th Air Force, only 30% of all crews actually completed a tour of duty of 25 missions. And indeed, the air campaign against Germany had gone very badly. In August of 1943, in particular, the first major raid into Germany, deep into Germany, the famous Regensburg-Schweinfurt raid on August 17, 1943, 60 B-17s had gone down in a single day. A second raid against Schweinfurt in October, 60 more heavy bombers had gone down. In one single week in October of 1943, 130 B-24s and B-17s had been lost in raids over Germany. The air war in Europe was very shaky indeed. The turning point would come in early 1944, deployment of the P-51 Mustangs in a big way, and in a series of major raids in February, the last week of February, called Big Bird. Those raids, which would decimate the German Air Force, would also see 137 heavy bombers lost in a week, or 148 I should say. Terrible losses. Although the chances of survival increased in 1944 for heavy bomber crews in the European theater of operations, the numbers remained, the absolute numbers of casualties remained extraordinarily high. In the first few months from January, February, March, April of 1944, heavy bombardment crews were losing 30% of their crews month after month. The average tour of duty for an 8th Air Force bomber crew in the spring of 1944 was 15 missions. In January, the new commander of the 8th Air Force, Jimmy Doolittle, had actually raised the number of missions for a tour of duty from 25 to 30. Those people who had been close to that 25 mission tour of duty now saw theirs extended. So one of the men I interviewed said that he had flown 25 missions for Uncle Sam and then 3 more for an SOB named Jimmy Doolittle. I wasn't very happy about this. Later, the missions would be raised to 35. With more and more planes and crews arriving in Europe, the odds of surviving when Roy Allen and his crew arrived in Europe were improving significantly, but the casualties remained stubbornly high. As I said, in early 1944, the life expectancy of an 8th Air Force bomber and his crew was only 15 missions, and the absolute number of casualties rose dramatically, peaking actually in April and May of 1944 when Roy and his crew arrived. In those months, 671 heavy bombers would be lost. Even though the Luftwaffe had been severely weakened, flak continued to take a very heavy toll. Indeed, by war's end, anti-aircraft fireplanes, more American aircraft in Europe than did fighters. Under these circumstances, survival was a considerable accomplishment. Although the practice was unofficial and varied from group to group, each man who completed the tour was given what was called a lucky bastard certificate, stating that he'd flown 25 or 30 or later 35 missions in the big leagues of aerial combat and is going home to God's country, the lucky bastard. As the spring of 1944 progressed and D-Day approached, the shift in targeting had taken place away from German aerodromes and German aircraft production to transportation targets, particularly in France and the Low Countries, to block the Germans from sending reinforcements to the Normandy beaches. And it was against such a target that Roy Allen and his crew had taken off on June 14, just over a week after the D-Day landings. In briefing at 0330, the operations officer had indicated that the raid on the Le Bourget airfield ought to be something of a milk run. Easy in, easy out. Little flak was expected along the route, although the possibility of enemy aircraft near the target was a distinct possibility. The skies over northern France that day would be crowded. The entire 3rd Air Division would be hammering targets in the Paris area. But the men of Roy Allen's crew were enormously relieved on June 14th. They would not be going back to a target in Germany. The first few missions, a couple had been to targets in Belgium, which had been easy in, easy out. And then had come 2 raids in a row to Berlin in May, which were frightening. Then a raid against a synthetic oil refinery in the Merseburg-Magdeburg area. The plane had been hit over Dessau and had limped back to the air station, Platten, building on 2 engines, making a 1-wheel landing. So they were delighted to be going to France on what they assumed was going to be a relatively straightforward mission. Roy Allen was, in many ways, typical of the young Americans who flew and fought in the Second World War. He was young, not a professional military man, but a draftee. At 24 years of age, he was the old man of the crew, called Pappy by his 18-year-old, one of the 18-year-old waist gunners, a cowboy from Oklahoma. I often think, I know we have some 8th Air Force veterans here today, but I often think with putting together these air crews in the Second World War that some of them was done straight out of central casting from Hollywood, that there had to be somebody from Brooklyn. I think if the I secretly suspect that there was a program to train people to sound like they were from Brooklyn, so somebody could be from Brooklyn on these crews. Somebody from Peaches and Creek, complexion, Van Johnson type, from the Midwest, a slow-talking Texan, and so on. All of these seem to be part of a typical crew, and this was certainly the case for the Roy Allen crew. All 18, 19, 20 years of age. Roy at 24, and then returned 25, certainly the oldest man on the crew. As the plane approached the target area, it was a complicated course that day. The skies were crowded, and the formation it seemed to be slightly off course. As a consequence, an action that nobody liked to take was initiated, and that was to make a 360-degree turn, just approaching the target, and went around, and as the formation made this long, awkward, lumbering turn, they were jumped. German fighters appeared out of nowhere. This was the sort of case that one might find in 1944 and for the remainder of the war. Some missions, no German fighters at all, and others, it would appear, in terrifying numbers. Roy's plane, the lead plane just in front of them, exploded. The deputy lead, wing folded, dropped out of the formation, and before Roy could really adjust to that, his own plane was hit. Controls went soft, and he ordered the crew to bail out. As he made his way, finally, out of the pilot seat, assuming radio communications were shot in the plane, the co-pilot was gone, the bombardier, the navigator, all the people in the front. He assumed everybody was out. Tried to make it back to look to see if anyone was remaining. Got to the bomb bay, looked down. By this point, the plane was dropping, it remarkably stable. Looked down at this patchwork quilt of the French countryside below him, and realized he had absolutely no idea about how to deal with a parachute. He had one. He never jumped. He had the instruction and so on, and then thought, well, there's no choice, and jumped. Roy Allen was lucky that day because he came down, the chute open. He searched the sky to see if he could see any of the parachutes from the crew. Nothing. Nobody in sight. What he did see, however, was a grove of trees rushing at him from below, like a freight train. Tried to adjust the chute, to swing, to control it. Almost tipped the chute, collapsed the chute, crashed into the trees, but was all right. He landed. And then faced reality that he never really anticipated at all. The idea of being shot down, he'd obviously thought about it. The idea of being wounded, maybe, but the idea of suddenly finding himself on the ground in occupied France. None of his men around him, nobody that he knew inside. All he had was his escape and evasion kit with him, and now had to figure out what to do. One of the standard instructions for men bailing out over German occupied territory was possible move. First of all, get away from the parachute, get away from anything that will link to the plane. You can make contact not with a group, but with an individual, if at all possible. And so Roy, after hiding in the woods for several hours while German patrols swept through the area, fortunately with no dogs, he started heading in a direction that he thought was west, and shortly came across a young French man pushing a bicycle. That is, he assumed he was a Frenchman, looked French. Roy didn't speak a word of French, but finally stepped out of the woods, called to this young man, who motioned for him to follow, and Roy was taken to a farmhouse. At the farmhouse, wife and the young man, the son of the farming couple, chatted away to him in French. They didn't understand a word of English. They all talked to one another. A local gendarme was brought in. He knew a few English phrases. I think he's heard Ribault's stories from his years in the First World War with English troops, so he knew a few slang terms, but certainly didn't have very much of a sense of it. But they kept asking him questions. It became clear what they were doing was trying to determine whether, in fact, he was an American pilot. One of the standard ploys of the Germans was to, when planes had gone down in an area, was to plant an English-speaking German with an American uniform or a British uniform to be picked up by the French resistance, so that they would then, the Germans would be able to penetrate the group. A bit later in the afternoon, they kept talking about someone's coming, a young woman. And late in the afternoon, a young woman did appear. Her name was Colette. She was the daughter of the farming couple. She taught in the local girls' school in the tiny village of Jouy-le-Châtel, and she was going to translate. She spoke English, at least that was what they said. As it turns out, Colette did speak English. She taught English. She taught Shakespeare. She taught John Donne. She taught the poetry of Milton. And she listened to the well-rounded tones of the BBC whenever she dared to. She'd never heard anybody speak like Roy Allen, who spoke with a wonderful Philadelphia accent from Albany. So the two of them talked at one another for some time. They finally determined he was indeed a pilot, was an American. They couldn't figure out what 77th Avenue in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania was. It sounded like a terribly exotic place. But were finally convinced that he was an American. They determined that he couldn't stay at the farmhouse. They were members of the French resistance. He was to be taken into the village, hidden by Colette in her rooms above the schoolhouse. He couldn't stay in the farmhouse. It was a place the Germans came through frequently, and so Roy was to be taken into town. He was to be outfitted with French clothes. No small task. He was 6'1", 6'2", weighed about 185 pounds. Nobody in occupied France in 1944 weighed 185 pounds. He looked impossibly American. Big, good-looking man, open, had been a great schoolboy athlete in Philadelphia. Connie Mack, the owner and manager of the Philadelphia A's, had asked him to try out for the team when he was 17 years old. Had played sports for a year at Duke. So he didn't look very French. And he wore a size 13 shoe. Nobody in Europe wore a size 13 shoe, at least nobody west of the Rhine. And so he did, however, had managed to have his, I guess beneath his, with his flying equipment, had a pair of shoes, which he was able to, they didn't adopt her. He was taken into the village where he was to be hidden and told very clearly by Colette, there are no Germans stationed in the village, but it's not the Germans we have to worry about, it's the other French. The Germans were dangerous, the Gestapo was around, the Felt Gendarmerie, as it was called, was around. One had to be careful. But it was actually the other neighbors, the veterinarian across the street, even the local priest couldn't be trusted, the local doctor, and most important, the little girls in the two-room schoolhouse down below her suite of rooms couldn't hear Roy upstairs. And worse, the schoolmistress, the only other teacher in the school, lived in a suite of rooms just across the corridor from Colette. So Roy was going to have to be, this big American was going to have to be hidden in a small suite of rooms above a girls' school with a schoolmistress just across the way. He couldn't go out in the daytime, couldn't walk around when the girls were down below, couldn't listen to the radio, couldn't make any noise. This was exactly the sort of instruction given to any number of American and British airmen who found themselves on the ground in occupied France. Roy passed the time while hidden, making up crossword puzzles. He was great, loved to sing, loved the hit parade, and so he made up crossword puzzles. Was bored stiff, in fact, hiding, so that he took the names of songs, band leaders, and so on, and made very elaborate crosswords to pass the time. But he was a terrible person to hide. He discovered the radio in Colette's room, which he insisted on playing, dance music. He walked around, clonking around in a size 13 feet, so that the little girls downstairs heard him. And worse of all, he sang. He had quite a good voice, and was very proud of it, and sang. And so, at one point, Colette, who was driven to absolute distraction by this man, looked out the window, and a German convoy was coming through the small street of this village. And the German soldiers were looking up at the school, at her rooms, she realized. She darted upstairs and found Roy standing at the window, waving to the German troops as they went by. Well, I mean, I have to say, just in parentheses, on a personal note about this, I've often thought, having spent a decade interviewing Colette, that Roy Allen was in many ways quite very, very American. And one of the ways I think he was a certain sense of innocence about him. He was married, he had a child on the way, he was an experienced man, he'd been around, and in that sense he wasn't innocent. But I think he didn't understand the really sinister nature of the world that he had literally dropped into in occupied France. Colette, on the other hand, turned out to be a good Catholic girl, and innocent in that way, but certainly not innocent in terms of the dangers they faced. Roy insisted over and over again that he wanted to leave the village, that he wanted to try to make it back either to American lines, the army, the Americans were in Normandy, that hadn't broken out yet, but were there, or to be taken on what was called a chain of evasion. There were evasion lines that would be able to take him possibly into Paris first, but then through a series of contacts, possibly over the Pyrenees into Spain, or there were even a number of boats that went from Brittany. That was a possibility. And Roy really insisted that he wanted to get back to his unit, get word back to his wife. While he was hidden in the schoolhouse, the leader of the local French resistance came to visit. And he came to visit, in effect, to tell Roy to stay put. That any day now there was going to be a breakout. The Allies would break out of Normandy. When they did, the Germans wouldn't be able to hold them, and that Roy would be liberated along with the others in the village. Roy only knew this man as Captain Paul, the leader of the regional resistance. But in fact, Captain Paul was a British trained, was a man by the name of Trevose that I mentioned. He belonged to the British Secret Service. He had been dropped into occupied France, a French national who made it to Britain. He had been trained by SOE, Special Operations Executive, to organize resistance cells in France. And in 1944, these resistance cells played quite an important role. The point of SOE, of these resistance cells, they weren't spies. They weren't there to gather intelligence. They were there to conduct acts of terrorism against the Germans, acts of sabotage, to blow up railroad lines, to blow up barges, to destroy communications, to make life miserable for the Germans. SOE had been established by Winston Churchill in 1940 with the mission to, quote, set Europe ablaze. The way SOE operated was that 3 people would be parachuted into a particular area. The leader of the little group, the radio operator, and a courier. The courier was often a woman because they could move around in occupied France easier than men. Pierre leader of this SOE group. He'd been trained in Britain in the basics of covert operations, how to pass messages in a crowd, how to spot someone following them, how to code, ciphers, German counterintelligence measures, interrogations, cover stories, how to organize and lead reception committees. All the way through 1943 and 1944, the British led element of the French resistance. Dropped 300 agents into France. They set up 600 airdrops of weapons, and radios, and other supplies. And they had set up 40 different resistance organizations inside of France. Commando training, hand-to-hand combat, the art of what's called silent killing. The training was very, very difficult. They were watched constantly during their training in England. SOE leaders wanted to know who talked in their sleep and in what language. You couldn't have somebody who's going to be dropped into France and supposed to be French talking in his sleep in English. So they watched that. They wanted to know who drank too much, who talked too much, who boasted, who could be seduced. So all the way through the training for SOE, all of the men and women were subjected to all of these very rigorous sorts of tests. They were taken to France by 2 air squadrons called moon squadrons. They flew by the full moon. One squadron either landed in small planes, Lysanders, that would actually land in farmers' fields by the full moon. 2 agents would jump out, 2 agents would be taken back to Britain, or they were parachuted. In. So the man that Roy Allen met in this little schoolhouse in Juilly was not simply the local leader of the resistance. He was a man who had been trained by the British for major operations. Those operations were against sabotage against the Germans. They listened for instructions from the BBC. Every evening at 7:30 and 9:15, the BBC broadcast a program in French. Part of that program, at the end of it, was news and cultural matters for occupied France. If you recall, listen to it in France, by the way, you could be arrested and sent to a concentration camp. So it was a dangerous thing to do. But at the end of all the news programs, these 2 evening news programs, came a series of what we call personal messages. They were a series of things that sounded like nonsense. Uncle Jacques needs a new pair of shoes. I repeat, Uncle Jacques needs a new pair of shoes. The blue boat has sprung a leak. I repeat, the blue boat has sprung a leak. Some of these were nonsense, but a great many of them were specific coded instructions to each of these different resistance groups in France who were waiting for their instructions. They had their targets. And this was exactly the case for the group around Juilly. They were waiting for their messages to move into action. Roy nonetheless insisted was not to be put off, insisted that he be taken into Paris, and so indeed he was. He was moved along an evasion line that took him from Juilly into Paris, and in Paris, hidden for several weeks. And then in August, the next contact had come forward. He was to be moved from one hiding place in Paris to another. The second place he would be picked up by a man by the name of Captain Jacques. Captain Jacques was the contact who would take him, arrange for his passage across the Pyrenees into Spain. He was told by the resistance people not to worry. Captain Jacques was the ranking man in the resistance there, had been in charge of these evasion lines, and he had already moved 70 British and American flyers from Paris over the Pyrenees and back to England. Roy went with Captain Jacques, was taken to a cafe in Paris, pointed over to a table where 2 men got up, motioned for him to come with them to a waiting Citroën car, drove him around the Arc de Triomphe down a huge boulevard called the Avenue Foch in Paris to number 84 Avenue Foch, drove into the main entrance, and then one of the men said, "Welcome, you're at Gestapo headquarters." Captain Jacques, in fact, was a Gestapo double agent who had been turning over American and British flyers to the Gestapo for months on end. And Roy Allen now found himself in German captivity. He was caught in civilian clothes. He had given up his dog tags. He didn't want to, but Captain Jacques had insisted that his dog tags be given up. So now he was in German hands, not in the hands of the military, but in the hands of the Gestapo. It didn't play by the beginning rules. And he said, "Well, you say you're an American flyer, but in fact, he had false papers." False papers said, I think it was a wonderful irony, that he was Louis Rouet from Cherbourg. That was safe because Cherbourg was now cut off from the Germans. They couldn't check it because the Allies were there. But he was also supposed to be a deaf mute. For somebody who liked to sing, this was, they thought, ironic. The Germans say, "You say you're an American. You say you're a pilot. But look, you have these papers that say you're French." They also say that you're a deaf mute, which you clearly are not. So they threatened him to beat him up. And then, as they emptied out his pockets onto the table, they discovered something that he'd forgotten to take out of his pockets. And that were the crossword puzzles that he'd been working on at Colette's and in the places in Paris. The Germans looked at this, and here you have a list of names and a list of clearly coded messages. "Is you is," or "Is you ain't my baby," "Roll me over in the clover," "I'll be seeing you," "Shoo shoo baby," a whole series of these things. And to the Germans, this is code. You know, you're a spy, you're a terrorist. We're going to shoot you tomorrow, so you might as well tell us. What they really wanted, they knew he was an American. That was perfectly obvious. What they wanted was they wanted to know how he'd gotten the civilian clothes. They wanted to know how he got into Paris. They wanted to know how he'd gotten these false papers. And he was subjected to torture. But the way the resistance operated, Roy couldn't really tell them very much. He didn't know people's last names. He couldn't really tell them where he'd been. He was terrified that he would say something that would slip up and reveal Colette's identity. He did not do that. The date for all of this was the third week of August 1944. Paris was liberated on August 25th. Roy Allen was put in a prison, and then finally on August 20th, the prison was empty, and been taken to a freight station in Paris. 85 to 90 men shoved into cattle cars that were supposed to hold 40 people. 5-gallon pail of water, and an empty 5-gallon pail. The men packed in so closely nobody could sit down, nobody could fall over. They were simply wedged in like sardines. There were 168 British, American, Australian, and New Zealand airmen, all of whom had been caught by the Germans in civilian clothes, many of them by this Captain Jacques. They went on a 5-day nightmare journey across France into Germany. The airmen hoped that they were headed to a POW camp. They thought they might be going to the famous interrogation center north of Frankfurt, de la Luft. But the train went on through Frankfurt and kept moving east. And finally, after 5 days, during which they'd been strafed by American fighters, and the 2 men had been executed by the Germans, the train pulled into the city of Weimar in central Germany, and then began moving at a slow grade outside the city, where are we? What is this place? And the man yelled back the word none of the Americans really do, but some of the French boxcars did, and the word was Buchenwald. They were not in a POW camp, but at Konzentrationslager Buchenwald. These 168 airmen were kept in Buchenwald from August 25th, 1944, until October, mid-October of 1944, when they were finally transferred out of this horror. Buchenwald was not one of the great death camps, not Auschwitz or Treblinka or one of the Soviet War, one of the camps. It was theirs as a machine of death. But Buchenwald was the labor camp where people were starved to death, beaten to death, terrible, horrible place for political prisoners. They were finally moved because the German Luftwaffe came and got them out, claiming them as their prisoners, as they were legitimately airmen, and not to be prisoners of the Gestapo or the SS. Left behind, however, was Roy Allen. Roy had dropsy, pneumonia, scarlet fever, and dysentery. Everybody in Buchenwald had dysentery, but he lost a third of his body weight and was left behind. While he was in Buchenwald, ironically enough, one of the other airmen that he met in this horrible cesspool of a place was a guy who had a familiar sort of accent. And somebody said, there's another guy here from Philly. Seemed unlikely. 168 guys from the Allied world in Buchenwald. As it turns out, it was the man from Warren Bauer who had gone to Northeast High School here in Philadelphia, one of Alney's high school's great opponents, and the two hit it off. Roy would be left in the camp along with Warren Bauer until December of 1944, when miraculously he also was transferred. Although Roy didn't know it, Pierre Milson, the leader of the regional resistance from the area around Juilly, was also in Buchenwald at the same time. He hadn't been caught because of Roy. He'd been caught on a completely other set of circumstances. And Pierre Milson would be executed by the Germans as approximately 2,000 French resistance people were. Roy then wound up in, from Buchenwald, was transferred to Stalag Luft 3 in Silesia, one of the largest camp for Allied airmen. He arrived in December, where miraculously he met his co-pilot, or rather his co-pilot and his navigator, who informed him that his son had been born. The co-pilot had come down, the navigator had come down, and been caught instantly, and they'd gotten word from the States that Roy Jr. had been born. But Roy was there just long enough to be part of what came to be known as the Zagan Death March. On January 25th, 1945, the Russians were coming from the east, and the Germans began to empty out the big prison camps, concentration camps farther east, and then the prison camps holding Allied prisoners. They marched Roy and these 10,000 American and British flyers out of Stalag Luft 3 in the middle of the night during a raging blizzard. Marched them 5 miles to a railhead where they were then transferred and finally wound up in most were prison camp outside of Munich. Now, this is the story I tried to tell in this book. What does it all mean? What at the end of the day does one know? It seemed to me that it tells us an awful lot about life and death in the 8th Air Force, because it turns out 9 of the 10 men on Roy's crew survived. Only the bombardier was killed, and one suspects shot in his parachute as he came down. The Some were captured by the Germans, some successfully hidden by the French resistance. Some 2,000 American airmen would be moved, or 2,000 Allied airmen, I should say, had been successfully hidden and moved by the French resistance in the course of 1944 and into 1945. It says an awful lot about the French resistance as well. I think at a time when American-French relations are not the best these days, it is important to remember the services that some of them performed in 1944. French resistance was very small, but those people who were in it took their lives in their own hands, as Pierre Mousson certainly indicates. Roy was always concerned about what had happened to Colette. When he was finally transferred out of, he was liberated in most by General Patton, along, ironically, with the two surviving members of my uncle's air crew were also there. Went AWOL and made his way to Paris and to determine whether Colette had been caught. He'd been tormented by this worry for months, only to discover that she was, in fact, safe. She had not been caught. She had not done anything. They had not traced it back to her. So I think the story, there's a story of remarkable courage, a story of perseverance, of self-sacrifice, treachery, one of countless stories of the turbulent year 1944, but one that seems to me that ought to be remembered and retold. Thanks. I'm happy to take questions or hear comments. Yes?
Could you explain a little bit about how you became aware of the story?
Yes, how did I become aware of the story? When I was working on Wings of Morning, Philip Inquirer ran a number of stories about, this was back in the early 90s, and various people came forward, wrote or called and said, I have a story that, especially about flying, because I was interested in things having to do largely with the Air Force. And Roy Allen's son, George Allen, came to my office, and he brought with me a scrapbook. There were a lot of interesting, wonderful stories, powerful stories. But here was one. When George sort of told me the outlines of the story, he didn't know all of it, but the outlines of it he did. But here were these photographs. Here were photographs of his father and his father's crew. Then a picture of a crashed aircraft made by the French. A picture of Roy in his French resistance clothes looking impossibly American. A picture of Colette, who hid in it. Colette, I don't know if I mentioned it. Colette, Roy was 6'2". Colette is about 4'11", maybe, standing on her tiptoes. So a picture of her. The day that Roy Allen left Juilly to go into Paris, you hear the French resistance was usually so careful, but this one guy wanted to take a picture. And so he snapped a picture of Roy, again, holding a beret in his hand. I would love to have seen the picture of Roy with a beret on, because it just would have been too much. But him looking American, and the other guy was so British looking that you thought, these two guys don't have a prayer. They're going to be caught before they get out of the city limits. And indeed, Roy was caught. So these photographs. Then I went to France. I interviewed Colette. And then one thing led to another. She introduced me to more people who'd been in the resistance there. I discovered then the person that they had all been calling Paul Guérin, Captain Paul, was in fact a man named Pierre Mousson. He had been a British operative. Found his records in the Foreign Office files for SOE in Britain. I went to Buchenwald. I speak German. And I speak just enough French to get myself in trouble so that I had enough she and I spoke, it was a perfect, I thought this is a good example of what it must have been like as she and Roy tried to negotiate. So I went to all the places. I found the places that Roy was sitting in Paris. I went into, I looked at them. I actually went into the apartments, rang doorbells, got in to look at various places I shouldn't have. Actually came close to getting into 84th Avenue Fush, the old Gestapo headquarters. But my wife restrained me and said, Tom, you'll be the only person ever arrested trying to break into Gestapo headquarters in Paris. So a lot of interviewing, a lot of records, a lot of going and walking in places. I think it's awfully important to see these places. Buchenwald, for example, I'd seen lots of photographs of it. I'd seen film from the liberation of Buchenwald. The Americans liberated it on April 11th. But until I was there and actually walked it, a lot of it's still there, the gate, the crematory, and the torture chambers. It's on a hill, it's a very steep grade. And just being there and seeing it, when you were down at the end of the camp and the Americans were incarcerated, you were literally at the bottom of the world in a real cesspool. Then going through, I've done a lot of work on 8th Air Force things, so I was able to talk to a lot of people from the 457. I found the navigator, Joe Bruce, is still alive. Walter Gunner is still alive. Talked to them, and then pieced all of this